We are already right now feeling the heavy effects of climate change, and it's hurting all of us, and it's only going to get worse. Like I said, I'm stealing from the future generations. But what am I supposed to do? Walk everywhere? Not buy groceries? Where am I supposed to find truly ethical businesses in an economic system that punishes ethical practices? Perhaps this is what is meant by we are all sinners. Human society does not allow us to not sin.
Drama has followed the Ten Commandments since the beginning. God himself spoke from the top of Mount Sinai with thunder and lightning. The commandments are the only part of Scripture that God himself physically wrote. Down through the ages, the commandments have been the benchmark of morality in Judeo-Christian thought, and today, the displaying of the commandments continues to be a source of controversy and drama. But what are the commandments? These 10 rules important enough for God to personally deliver. Join us on this 12-part journey through the commandments that form the bedrock for what following Christ looks like.
When I was working as a Bible worker for a church in Colorado, the pastor, who was also my cousin, and I decided to spend one afternoon before I left for home hiking up deep in the Rockies. Now, to get there, we needed a Jeep or some kind of off-road vehicle that could handle the roads that our Camry wasn't quite up to. One of the elders was kind enough to lend us his Jeep. It was a black soft-top Jeep. And given that we lived in a very small, quiet town where really nothing ever happened, he felt perfectly comfortable leaving it on the side of the highway, keys in the car. On the day of the hike, my pastor and I found a black soft-top Jeep on the side of that highway, keys in the front seat, parked our car, took the Jeep, head off, had a great adventure that was a little more exciting than we intended it to be. Well, that's a story for another time. And then we came back to the spot where the elder had left his Jeep, only to find our car wasn't there. We started panicking a little bit, to be honest. And we called him up and immediately and said, "Hey, where exactly did you leave your Jeep? We can't seem to find our car after we picked it up today." To our astonishment, he replied, "What are you talking about? You never picked up my car." I will never forget sitting in the passenger seat listening to my cousin say, "Well, then whose Jeep do we have?" Turns out, we had accidentally committed grand theft auto. And we drove up a little bit further down the highway, found where our car was parked this random person's Jeep that also happened to be an identical black soft-top Jeep with the keys in the front seat, got in our car and hightailed it out of there. Now, as with the previous two commandments, the commandment on theft, which if you haven't been able to figure out is the topic for this one, is just 2 words in Hebrew. And like the others, it seems simple enough on the surface, although in my case, not stealing turned out to be a little more complicated. But as we've seen with the previous commandments, the standard that God is holding us to is much, much higher than the technical or legal sense of the commandment, or of the command. Again, God doesn't ask us to simply not kill people or not commit murder. He asks us to control our emotions, to control our angers and our hatreds, to genuinely love each other. Adultery is far more than simply not having sex with somebody I'm not married to, or more specifically, not betraying my wedding vows. Adultery starts by abusing the power and the responsibilities I have in a relationship, at least in God's eyes. So this should come as no surprise that theft is far more complicated than not randomly stealing other people's cars or other properties. So to understand precisely, or as close to precisely as we can, what God is expecting us when he commands us, "Do not steal," let's dive in. To understand what this truly means, or to truly follow the 8th commandment, we first have to accept something that flies in the face of one of America's most cherished principles, and that is the idea of private ownership. It's a lie. We have to deconstruct the myth of mine. This is a hard concept for us to wrap our brains around, especially those of us who grew up in a Western, especially American society, where the protection and rights of private ownership is one of the most foundational principles. When you look at, for example, the American Revolution from an economic perspective, really it was about private ownership and private business. Now, for someone who may have grown up under communism, what I just said when I say private ownership is a lie, the myth of mine, That sounds frighteningly like Marxism, and may be triggering you into some communist dystopian nightmares. Don't worry, I'm not going to be advocating for communism, not even remotely. In fact, if we're going to apply some sort of economic construct to what the Eighth Commandment is talking about, feudalism actually might be nearer the mark. Of course, we haven't practiced feudalism in about 500 years. Feudalism basically is the idea that you have a lord whom his vassals, lesser lords, owe fealty to, and he grants them property in exchange. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? After all, the first commandment, the greatest commandment that we discussed, was that loving God is having absolute fealty to God. In fact, the whole book of Deuteronomy is couched in the terms of a suzerain vassal treaty. It very much is in line with, not exactly, but in line with the principles of feudalism, which wouldn't be terribly surprising given the fact that quasi-feudalism, this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but quasi-feudalism is, of course, the economic structure that the Israelites were in. You have an overlord, a king, who then grants lands and property to his vassals, and they in turn grant properties to their vassals in return for taxes and military service, so on and so forth. All the way down the line until you have, well, actually most people as the peasants underneath it all. But the basic idea is that the land, property, everything, in fact, belongs to God. And that as his vassals, he has given us his property as essentially a loan that he can take back at any time. The land, and this is how God treated the ancient Israelites. He gave them land. We're going to discuss this more in detail in a moment here. But he gave them land, an inheritance, in exchange for their fealty. But it was still God's, just as the land that a lord gives his vassal is always still the Lord's, and he can recall it at any time he so chooses. But he gives the vassal the responsibility and benefits of working the land themselves. Now, this is one of the most foundational principles in Scripture. Right from the get-go, literally the first statement in the Bible is the point that God is the true sovereign and owner of the entire universe, this little planet included. I mean, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, i.e. everything. He made it. He made everything. And therefore, he owns everything. God more explicitly drives his point home in Psalm chapter 50, where he makes it perfectly clear that he needs nothing from any human being. And the reason he doesn't need anything from us is, as he says in chapter 50, verse 12, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and everything in it." Now, it's tempting to take credit for the things that we build for ourselves. The work that we do, the income that we make, as being something that we do. But again, God very quickly disabuses of that notion. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, Yahweh tells the Israelites just that very thing. You may say to yourself, Yahweh says, "My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember Yahweh your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today." In other words, even the very ability to work and to produce an income, to make money, to build property, that all comes from God. And that is also something that God can recall whenever he wants. In fact, when we say that everything belongs to God, we mean everything. Yes, that means the cattle on 1,000 hills, as the psalmist says. That means your house, your car, your dog, your bank account, that all belongs to God. But that also even means that the very breath in your lungs right now is on loan to you from God. Something that he has every right to recall to himself at any moment he chooses, a point that Job, Psalms, and Ecclesiastes all make abundantly clear. The consequence of this is that we have no right whatsoever to anything in our possession. It's all on loan from God, and we are therefore answerable to God for how it is used. This again is exactly how the Bible describes our relationship with God and with things. Again, going back to Genesis chapter 1, when God creates humanity, he creates them in his image. Now, this should make you recall back to our discussion on the second commandment, The second commandment section, make no graven images, right? The idea that the image of God in the ancient Near East was essentially functional. The people who bore the image of God, whether in a signet or bore the image of God or bore the image of a king, for example, whether in a signet ring or some other vehicle, bore the authority and responsibility of the king that was on loan to them. The image of a person or deity was given their qualities to act on their behalf as their representative. Again, mentioned this before, but it's worth reminding ourselves. The Assyrian kings were in the image of God, probably specifically referring to Ashur. Similarly, for hundreds of years, about first 500 years or so of Assyria as a state, their rulers did not take the title of king, but rather referred to themselves as shikanu, or governors, or viceroys would be another term for it, that acted on Ashur's behalf. It wasn't well into the Middle Assyrian period that they took the title of sharu, or king. Ashur was the true king, and even all the way down to Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, you have the statement repeated, Ashur is king, Ashur is king. The human monarch was merely his representative, his image bearer. And this is exactly how Genesis 1 and 2 describes human beings. We are God's representatives, his vice-regents on earth, given the task of ruling and caring for his world. Again, this goes back to our discussion on the second commandment and the fourth commandment as well. But the earth is still fundamentally God's property. Just as the viceroy wouldn't claim ownership over what was entrusted to him by the king unless he was starting a coup, in which case he wouldn't recognize the king as the authority got from the king anyway, we cannot claim ownership over what God has entrusted to us as his representatives. We don't own it any more than the viceroy does. Well, this may be difficult to really process, given how much our culture values private ownership and the idea of the possessions that are ours. From a biblical perspective, it actually makes real sense. After all, this is how God framed his relationship with the people of Israel, starting with the Shema. Again, this goes back to the greatest commandment, to love God, which we've referenced and we've already discussed. Furthermore, Yahweh would explain regarding the selling of property in Leviticus 25:23, the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Even in the promised land that was their home country, the Israelites were not actually owners of it. They were treated as migrants in their own country because it belonged fundamentally to God. The inheritance that Yahweh parcels out to the Israelites was essentially fiefs. His land that the Israelites families got to take care of and work as Yahweh's tenants. Another illustrative example of this is Jesus' parable about the talents in Matthew 25:14-30. While the parable has a lot more to do with an explanation of the expectation God has for his people in the last days, it is notable that none of the servants owned what they were given, nor did they own the profits off of their hard work. And work with the talents they were given. It's not like the man who was given 5 talents and earned 10, or earned 5 more, he didn't give back the original 5 talents and got to keep the profit as his wages. No. He had to give all 10 talents back to the king or the master as his property. Even the original principal and the gain all belong to the master, none of it to the servant. The same is true, essentially, for literally everything in the universe. None of us own anything. Everything we have, including and especially the things that we've worked hard to earn, are God's, not ours, and to be claimed and reclaimed by him whenever he wishes. And again, that just doesn't include our physical possessions or our bank accounts. That includes our time and even our varying beings. It is all God's. So what are the consequences of this? Why does it matter? Interestingly, in the Torah, God actually does discuss at length the protection of property, which may sound contradictory. If we own nothing and it's all God's, why does any of it matter? The answer to that is at the heart of what theft is, which is a desire for more, or more specifically, a desire for things that we do not have and do not have necessarily a right to. It is the opposite of loving our neighbor, where we value our neighbor's good above our own. Again, refer back to our discussion on the second greatest commandment. At the heart of theft is seeking our own good above that of our neighbor. So while there are a lot of laws regarding theft and the punishments thereof, in reality, these laws are putting limits on and checks on the pursuit of wealth itself. Theft isn't just about breaking into someone's sheep pen, although that is one aspect of it. It is chasing after gain through any and all means. For example, moving a boundary stone in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 14, and Proverbs 15:25 and 22 and 28. These are all references to this idea of moving a boundary stone, which is not something we think of today, but those all describe that action as theft. Taking land from your neighbor, no matter how small it may seem, to increase your own. That's why you would move a boundary stone. Oh, I guess you could move it as a prank, but I don't know why you would move a boundary stone that has nothing to do with you. Leviticus 19:35 and 36 condemns the use of false weights in the marketplace, also as theft. Slave laws are another interesting regulation against exploitation, viewed as theft. This one may sound a little backwards to us, but most slavery in the Old Testament, although to be fair, not all of it, most slavery was debt slavery, essentially indentured servitude. Now, no matter the debt, however, an Israelite could only be a slave for a maximum of 7 years. Then they were to go free with no debt left over. In a similar vein, property could not be sold forever. In the year of Jubilee, all land was reverted back to the original ancestral owner or descendants thereof. If the person who bought the slave or land, took a loss, well, too bad. In fact, Yahweh makes it explicitly clear that people couldn't use the excuse that it was almost the year of Jubilee to devalue property or not take on someone's debt as a slave. In fact, it says, don't count the years until the year of Jubilee. On top of that, both slaves and land could be redeemed at any time at cost. In other words, no one was really making much, if any, profit off of buying land from impoverished Israelites or taking them as debt slaves. Really, it was more of a bailout than anything else. In fact, the Torah goes out of its way prohibiting profiting off of other people. Interest is absolutely forbidden. It's called usury. It's another term for it. Can you imagine, by the way, what our economy would look like if we got rid of interest? No interest on credit cards, loans, mortgages, savings accounts, any of it. Our entire economic system would probably collapse overnight. It's frankly not feasible. Yet, this is how Israel was supposed to work. No interest on any loan, period. Maximizing harvest was forbidden as well. We discussed this in the passage on the second greatest commandment. The edge of the fields, whatever fell on the ground, multiple passes over vines and trees, all forbidden, and to be left to the poor to be gathered free of charge. Lost property was to be returned to the owner. There was no finders keepers in ancient Israel. Perhaps most importantly, kings were forbidden to accrue wealth for themselves, which should make us rethink Solomon's accomplishments. Doing any of these, as the prophets make especially clear, God viewed as theft and even forms of violence. Now, many of you who might be working in some sort of business field may be sitting there wondering how on earth anyone was supposed to make money or make a profit in ancient Israel. That's the point. They weren't. They were supposed to get what they needed to live, and really that's about it. Profit wasn't the goal. Wealth wasn't to be a goal or a desire. And this is something that the New Testament takes to a whole new level. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus charges his followers to give more than whatever is asked. If someone asks for your coat, give them your shirt as well. If someone forces you to go with them 1 mile, go 2 miles, so on and so forth. Paul declares in 1 Timothy 6:10, the love of wealth is the root of all evils. There are two powerful examples in Jesus' teachings that give us an idea of the perils that come with the myth of mine. There's the rich young ruler who could not part with his wealth and follow Jesus. And it's important to understand the context, what Jesus was asking him. He asked him to sell everything that he had. Okay? For many people, particularly wealthy people, that's actually fairly easily done. Give everything away because they can make it back pretty quickly. But then Jesus said, "Follow me." Not just sell all your possessions and give all the proceeds to the poor, but leave your businesses behind, and with it, the ability to get money back. And that was just too much for the young man, and he went away sorrowful, rather choosing hell and keeping his possessions than following Christ with nothing. Another parable that Jesus tells is of an arrogant landowner who experienced a supreme bumper crop one year. But instead of sharing his fortune with others, especially the less fortunate, this man decided to build bigger barns to store and hoard away all of his wealth. God's response was, "You fool, tonight your life will be claimed from you." And Jesus' point is, in all of these instances, your wealth is not yours, it never was, neither is your life. It all belongs to God and can be reclaimed at a moment's notice. Do not attach yourself to any of it, and do not seek what you can never possess. The Bible is clear that the pursuit of wealth is theft, full stop. Instead, as Paul recommends, the follower of Christ is to be at peace with whatever God sees fit to give us in that particular moment. Are we rich? Praise God, although we should probably ask some questions as to how we got there. Okay? Be content. Share your excess with others. Are you poor? Praise God, and be content with that in that moment. Again, see Philippians 4:10-13. So if we have plenty, be content. If we have little, be content. There are two interesting parallel stories in Scripture, and we've referenced both of these, I think, before in this series, about what happens, about how to treat wealth when it comes our way, and the dangers of pursuing wealth and hanging on to it, and the virtue of just letting it go is what it is, which is nothing. And the difference is illustrated in the stories of two men, Ahab and Boaz. Ahab was perhaps Israel's most powerful king, inheriting what his father Omri had built, a quasi-empire, which was an economic and military powerhouse, and Ahab, to his credit, certainly built on that, expanding and strengthening Israel's military, territory gains, and economic reach. Yet, none of that ever seemed to be enough for Ahab, as the story of Naboth's vineyard illustrates. Despite having just about whatever he could possibly have wanted, Ahab desired Naboth's vineyard to the point that he was an accessory to murder to get it. The consequence was a death sentence from Yahweh carried out at Ramoth Gilead, where Ahab was leading his men into battle to conquer a city that wasn't his. But Boaz, a wealthy landowner in Bethlehem, or wealthy by Bethlehemite standards, had no problem in simply giving his wealth away to a foreign woman, a migrant, to whom he had no connection whatsoever. When you look at the sums of grain that he just gave Ruth, it is an astonishing quantity, like gallons of grain, in a land where most people barely had enough to survive year to year. But he just gave it away. Boaz, it seems, understood that his harvest was never actually his. So why should he bother hanging on to it? It is Yahweh's, and Yahweh instructs us to give to the migrant, to the poor, to the widow. Ruth hit all three. You can't lose, Boaz understood, what you never had. In the end, Boaz got a wife, children, and became the father of kings, all by letting go of what he never possessed to begin with. So what do we do with all of this? We live in a society that idolizes and glorifies wealth and the pursuit of it, the hustle, the grind, to get everything you can, to secure the bag. There's a bazillion different phrases for basically making as much as you can, as quick as you can. And because I am painfully single, my social media algorithms, or used to, I've in fact, because of this, I've largely gotten rid of a lot of social media, decided they must constantly remind myself of this fact by populating my feed with dating stuff. And a lot of it has to do with women want a guy who makes 6 figures plus and not wanting to settle for anything less. I get tons of encouragement and guides on building wealth and my own little empire. And while I do not think that most women are so shallow, at least I certainly hope not, there's a societal reflection there. We value wealth. We idolize it. If we don't have it, we want to be with people who do. And we want to get it for ourselves. So one way of keeping this commandment is simply not to play the game. Don't chase after wealth and status. Work hard not to gain approval from human beings, because doing our best, as Paul exhorts us, in whatever circumstances, is our duty to God. And God will give us what we need to serve him today. And that should be enough. But in our society, so steeped in this avaricious pursuit of mine, getting mine, my bigger bank account, bigger car, bigger house, better vacations, I wonder if we are always complicit in some form of theft. And I don't mean accidentally stealing a car on the side of the road. I used to get monthly subscriptions from Amazon, and where I would set up a subscription, they would deliver things to my house. I mean, we've all used Amazon, right? I order my groceries to be delivered. Yet I know that these companies exploit their employees to bring me that cheap and convenient stuff. They profiteer off of suppressed wages and overworking their employees. As someone who has worked in an Amazon warehouse and driven for them, I can attest for you that I can attest both of those firsthand. The people at the top get rich and rich and rich off of the backs of their underlings. So why do I patron these businesses? No, frankly, because it saves me money and time. I profit off of them as well, so who am I to judge Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? Yet that is true also of virtually every business. Again, our entire economy is based on this construct. All businesses in our capitalist economy, by necessity, must grow their profit margins, which means raising prices, suppressing wages, and lowering the quality of materials if they can. When I look at my stock investments in my retirement fund, and that is frankly how they grow, I am still profiteering, would be a better way of putting it, off of exploitation. When I consider my time and my use of resources, am I stealing from others? I mean, in driving my car, I'm contributing to global warming, which is one of the primary drivers of our housing crisis and immigration crisis, rising food prices, as well as stealing an environment, a hospitable environment from future generations. We are already right now feeling the heavy effects of climate change, and it's hurting all of us, and it's only going to get worse. Like I said, I'm stealing from the future generations. But what am I supposed to do? Walk everywhere? Not buy groceries? Where am I supposed to find truly ethical businesses in an economic system that punishes ethical practices? Perhaps this is what is meant by we are all sinners. Human society does not allow us to not sin. I don't have good answers for all of this. I'm not some great sage who's figured it all out, if you haven't guessed that already. Other than to tell you to just do your best to minimize it as much as you can. It starts in our hearts and minds, but it's got to go beyond that, right? Like, thoughts and prayers are never enough. But it does start there. Do we buy into the myth of mine? Are we content with what we have? What sacrifices of wealth and opportunity are we willing to make in order to truly love God by understanding that He is our sovereign and owns everything we have, including our very lives? What sacrifices are we willing to make for the benefit of our neighbor, though the one who is disadvantaged among us? What are we willing to hold on to as ours, which in truth is nothing? So as we close, I exhort you to let go of ownership May you find contentment in what God has given you today. May Jesus guide you and me the wisdom to navigate the path forward in a world determined to make us chase after that which we cannot hold.